The sun broke over the Pacific on March 17, 1945, painting the waters around Iwo Jima in shades of blood and gold. Lieutenant Tadashi Yamamoto stood on the flight deck of the carrier Zuikaku, one of the last operational carriers in the Imperial Japanese Navy, watching mechanics make final adjustments to his Mitsubishi A6M50. The morning air was cold, sharp with salt and oil fumes. Around him, the deck bustled with organized chaos, ground crews shouting, propellers spinning to life, the metallic clang of ammunition being loaded into wing-mounted cannons. Tadashi was 24 years old. He had flown 73 combat missions. He had seen friends die in fire and smoke. He had watched the empire shrink, island by island, until now the homeland itself stood exposed. But this morning felt different. There was a heaviness in the air that had nothing to do with the weather. His Zero sat waiting, its Sakae engine ticking as it cooled between pre-flight checks. The aircraft was immaculate, rare for this stage of the war. Most Zeros now were patched together from salvaged parts, held together with wire and prayer. But this one had been specially maintained, its distinctive green-gray paint still intact, the red Hinomaru circles on the wings bright and defiant. Tadashi ran his hand along the fuselage, feeling the cold aluminum beneath his fingertips. Beautiful morning to die, isn't it? The voice belonged to Lieutenant Kenji Sato, his wingman. Kenji was leaning against the tail of his own Zero, smoking a cigarette he'd probably traded half his rice ration for. His flight suit was wrinkled, his face gaunt. They all looked gaunt now. "We're not dying today," Tadashi said quietly. Kenji laughed, a bitter sound. "We're always dying. We've been dying since Midway. The only question is whether it happens today or tomorrow." Before Tadashi could respond, Commander Fukuda emerged from the island superstructure, his face carved from stone. The briefing had been short, cryptic. A reconnaissance flight, they'd been told. 12 Zeros would fly northwest toward the Bonin Islands, search for American fleet movements, return before dark. Simple. Routine. Except nothing was routine anymore. "Mount up." Fukuda's voice carried across the deck. "Time to see what glory looks like before it disappears forever." Tadashi climbed into the Zero's cockpit, the familiar ritual grounding him. The seat cushion was worn thin. The stick felt like an extension of his hand. The instrument panel glowed with soft light, airspeed indicator, altimeter, oil pressure gauge, compass. Everything worked. Everything was ready. The deck officer raised his flag. Tadashi pushed the throttle forward, and the Sakae 14-cylinder radial engine roared to life with 1,130 horsepower. The Zero shuddered, straining against its brakes. Around him, 11 other fighters did the same, their propellers blurring into invisible discs, the sound building into a wall of mechanical thunder. The flag dropped. Tadashi released the brakes and the Zero leaped forward, accelerating down the flight deck. The carrier's bow rose and fell with the swells. Tadashi held the stick steady, watching the deck edge rush toward him, and then he was flying, wheels up, climbing into the pale morning sky, the ocean falling away beneath him like a vast blue eternity. The formation assembled at 3,000 feet. 12 Zeros in 3 flights of 4 arrowed northwest. Below, the Pacific stretched empty and indifferent. Above, the sky was clear except for scattered clouds hanging like torn silk. Tadashi checked his fuel gauge. Full tanks, enough for 4 hours of flight time. More than enough. The radio crackled. Dragon flight. Maintain heading 310. Climb to Angels 12. Radio silence unless enemy contact. Tadashi acknowledged with 2 clicks of his transmitter and pulled back on the stick. The Zero climbed effortlessly, its legendary maneuverability making it feel more like a living creature than a machine. At 12,000 feet, the air grew thin and cold. Tadashi adjusted his oxygen mask, tightening the seal against his face. They flew for 30 minutes. The monotony of patrol. The endless blue. the steady drone of the engine. And then Kenji's voice broke the silence. "Dragon Leader, I have smoke. Bearing 035, Angels 6. Tadashi looked. Far ahead, a thin column of black smoke rose from the ocean surface, barely visible against the horizon. His pulse quickened. American ship? Downed aircraft? Submarine? Dragon flight. Descend to investigate. Stay alert." They dropped through the sky in a wide spiral, Zeros tightening formation. As they descended below 5,000 feet, Tadashi saw it, not a ship but wreckage. Debris scattered across a square mile of ocean. Oil slicks. Bodies floating in life vests. And in the center, slowly sinking, the broken fuselage of AB-29 Superfortress. The Americans had been here. And then the sky exploded. The Hellcats came out of the sun like falling meteors. Tadashi saw the first one purely by instinct, a shadow crossing his canopy, too fast, too close. He broke hard right, shoving the stick over and kicking rudder, the Zero responding instantly. Tracers stitched the air where he'd been a heartbeat before, 50 caliber rounds glowing like angry fireflies. Ambush! Break! Break! The radio erupted with shouts. The formation shattered. 12 Zeros scattered across the sky as 8 American F-6F Hellcats dove into them, guns blazing. The neat tactical situation dissolved into chaos, aircraft twisting, turning, climbing, diving, each pilot fighting his own private war at 300 miles per hour. Tadashi pulled into a steep climbing turn, the Zero's engine screaming. A Hellcat flashed past below him, trying to follow, but the American fighter was heavier, less maneuverable. Tadashi reversed, rolling inverted and pulling through, and suddenly he was on the Hellcat's tail. His thumb found the cannon trigger. The two 20mm Type 99 cannons in his wings hammered, the recoil shuddering through the airframe. Shells walked across the Hellcat's fuselage. Pieces flew off. Smoke erupted from the engine cowling. The American fighter rolled away, trailing fire, and disappeared into a cloud. No time to confirm the kill. Another Hellcat was coming at Tadashi head-on, both aircraft closing at a combined speed of nearly 600 miles per hour. For a frozen instant, Tadashi could see the American pilot's face behind the windscreen, young, scared, determined. Then both pilots opened fire simultaneously. The air between them turned into a storm of steel. Tadashi held his course for 2 heartbeats, 3, then broke left at the last possible second. The Hellcat broke right. They passed so close Tadashi could have reached out and touched the other aircraft's wing. Then it was gone, and Tadashi was climbing again, head swiveling, searching for threats. Dragon 3 is hit. I'm losing oil pressure. Dragon 6, you have 2 on your tail. Brake left. Where's Dragon Leader? The sky had become a killing box. Tadashi saw 2 Zeros locked in a death spiral with 3 Hellcats, the aircraft tumbling through the sky like autumn leaves. He saw Kenji's Zero, distinctive for its faded paint, dodge past a burst of tracers, roll onto its back, and snap-shoot a Hellcat that ventured too close. The American fighter's canopy shattered. It fell away, smoking. But the numbers were wrong. Tadashi's mind calculated automatically, the product of years of training. 12 Zeros against 8 Hellcats should have been a fair fight, maybe even favorable. But the Americans had caught them low and slow, investigating the wreckage. The Hellcats had altitude, speed, position. And the Americans had been waiting. This wasn't a chance encounter. This was a trap. Dragon flight, disengage. Head northwest, full throttle. Tadashi pushed his throttle to the firewall. The Zero accelerated, its light weight becoming an advantage. But even as he climbed away from the furball, he saw 2 Hellcats peeling off to follow him. They couldn't turn with a Zero, but they could dive, and they had altitude to burn. The Hellcats came after him like wolves. Tadashi leveled off at 15,000 feet and opened the throttle wide. The Zero's engine was running hot, the temperature gauge climbing toward the red line, but it was still pulling strong. Behind him, the two Hellcats were gaining, inch by inch. The American fighters were faster in level flight, especially at altitude. It was only a matter of time. Think. He couldn't outrun them. Couldn't outgun them. They had 650 caliber machine guns to his two 20mm cannons and two 7.7mm machine guns, and American fighters could take more punishment than a Zero's unarmored frame could dish out. But he could outturn them. Every Japanese pilot knew that. The Zero's legendary maneuverability was the only advantage left. Tadashi waited until the Hellcats were in gun range, tracers reaching out toward him like glowing fingers. Then he hauled the stick back and to the right, kicking hard rudder. The Zero snap-rolled and reversed course in a maneuver no Hellcat could follow. The American fighters shot past below him, still going 350 miles per hour. For 5 seconds, Tadashi had the advantage. He dove, rolled inverted, pulled through, and now he was behind the trailing Hellcat. His thumb mashed the trigger. Cannons roared. The first burst missed. The second burst hit, shells tearing into the Hellcat's tail, shredding the rudder. The American fighter yawed sideways, trailing debris. But the second Hellcat had reversed and was coming back. And Tadashi's fuel gauge was showing half empty. He had burned through his reserves in the dogfight. The mathematics were brutal. He was 200 miles from the carrier, burning fuel at combat power, and the Americans were between him and home. Even if he won this fight, even if he killed both Hellcats, he didn't have enough fuel to return. The realization hit him like ice water. He was going to die out here. Not in fire and glory, but when his engine coughed dry and the Zero became a glider over empty ocean. Unless... Tadashi looked northwest. The Bonin Islands were close, maybe 80 miles. He'd studied the maps. Chichijima had a small airstrip, but the Americans had taken Iwo Jima. They were everywhere now, pressing closer. The island chains were falling one by one. And then he saw it, through a break in the clouds, an island. Small, rocky, a thin strip of green jungle and white beach. American. Japanese. Abandoned? The Hellcat behind him opened fire. Tracers streaked past his canopy. One round punched through his left wing, leaving a neat hole in the aluminum skin. Tadashi made his decision in a heartbeat. He dove for the island. The Zero screamed toward the island at 400 miles per hour, the airframe shaking, the engine howling. Tadashi held the stick with both hands, forcing the nose down through turbulent air. Behind him, one Hellcat was still on his tail, the other had peeled off, probably low on ammunition or fuel. The American pilot was persistent, professional, and very, very good. Another burst of tracers. Closer this time. The island rushed up to meet him. Tadashi saw details now. Palm trees, a ridge of volcanic rock running along the spine, a beach on the western side. And there, barely visible through the jungle canopy, a clearing. Maybe 800 feet long. Maybe less. It would have to be enough. Tadashi pulled out of the dive at 500 feet, the G-forces pressing him into his seat. The Zero groaned, protesting, but held together. He dropped his landing gear, 3 seconds for the wheels to lock down, and chopped the throttle. Airspeed bled off rapidly. 200 knots. 150. 100. The Hellcat was still firing, but the angle was wrong now. The American couldn't follow Tadashi's tight turn without stalling. The bursts went wild, chewing up jungle 100 yards to the right. Tadashi slipped the Zero sideways, lined up with the clearing. Trees flashed past on both sides. The ground was coming up fast. Too fast. He hauled back on the stick, flaring, trying to bleed off the last of his speed. The Zero's wheels touched down hard, once, twice, bouncing on the uneven ground. Tadashi stood on the brakes. The aircraft slewed left, the tail coming around. He kicked right rudder, fighting to keep it straight. Ahead, the clearing ended in a wall of trees. 50 yards. 40. 30. The Zero's brakes screamed. The tires smoked. The tail dragged. 20 yards. 10. The Zero stopped with 15 feet to spare, the propeller spinning idly 3 feet from a massive palm trunk. For a long moment, Tadashi sat in the cockpit, hands still gripping the stick, heart hammering against his ribs. He was alive. He was on the ground. He was. The Hellcat roared overhead, pulling up and away. The American pilot must have seen the landing, must have watched the Zero disappear into the jungle. But he didn't come back. Maybe he was out of ammunition. Maybe he was out of fuel. Maybe he just didn't care about one more downed Zero when the entire Japanese empire was burning. Tadashi killed the engine. The sudden silence was deafening. He could hear his own breathing, loud inside his oxygen mask. He could hear the ticking of the cooling engine, the rustling of wind through palm fronds, the distant sound of surf. He was alone. Tadashi unbuckled his harness and climbed out of the cockpit, legs shaking. The Zero sat at an odd angle, one wheel stuck in soft sand, the fuselage covered in oil streaks and bullet holes. It was a miracle it had held together. He ran his hand along the wing, counting the holes. 7, 8, 9. One had punched through the main spar, missing the fuel tank by inches. He looked around the clearing. No structures. No people. No signs of habitation except for the clearing itself, and that looked old, overgrown, maybe made by a storm years ago. The island seemed deserted. Tadashi checked his watch. 10:47 a.m. He had enough daylight to assess the situation, maybe attempt repairs if the damage wasn't catastrophic. But first, he needed to know where he was. He pulled his flight map from the cockpit, unfolded it on the Zero's wing. His finger traced the route from the carrier. Northwest from Iwo Jima. The Bonin Islands were here. Chichi-jima, Hahajima, and scattered around them, dozens of smaller islands, most unnamed on the map. He tried to estimate his position based on flight time and heading, but without proper navigation equipment, it was guesswork. He could be on a Japanese-held island, or he could be behind American lines, or he could be on an island nobody cared about anymore. The sun climbed higher. The heat was oppressive. Tadashi stripped off his flight jacket and began inspecting the Zero systematically. The engine seemed intact, though it would need oil. The gauge had been dropping during the fight. The landing gear was functional. The control surfaces responded when he moved the stick. But the fuel tanks were the problem. He unscrewed the caps and looked inside. Maybe 20 gallons left. Enough for 30 minutes of flight time, maybe less. Not enough to reach the carrier, even if he knew where it was. He was stuck. Tadashi sat on the Zero's wing, thinking. His training had covered this scenario, theoretically. If downed behind enemy lines, evade capture, signal friendly forces, wait for rescue. But how did you signal friendly forces when you didn't know if any were left? When the radio in your aircraft was designed for short-range tactical communication, not long-distance distress calls. He spent the afternoon working on the Zero, more to keep himself busy than from any real hope of flying it out. He patched the bullet holes with strips of aluminum cut from a damaged panel. He topped off the oil reservoir with what little spare he carried. He tested the guns. Both cannons were jammed, probably from debris, but the machine guns still functioned. As evening approached, Tadashi heard it, the low, distant rumble of engines. Aircraft! He scrambled into the cockpit, ready to start the engine, to take off if necessary. But when the aircraft appeared over the tree line, his blood turned to ice. 4C, 47 transport planes, American markings bright on their wings, flying low and slow. They passed directly over the clearing, so close Tadashi could see the pilots in the cockpit. They didn't deviate, didn't circle, didn't seem to notice the Zero sitting in the jungle below them. Tadashi realized why. From above, the green-gray Zero blended perfectly with the jungle canopy. Unless you knew where to look, it was invisible. The C-47s disappeared to the west, and Tadashi understood where he was. He was on an island along an American flight route. A navigation waypoint, probably. The transports flew over regularly, which meant there was an American base nearby. Maybe on the next island. Maybe 20 miles away. He couldn't stay here. But he couldn't leave. As darkness fell, Tadashi made his decision. The destroyer USS Gregory found him 3 days later. Tadashi had survived on coconut water and the emergency rations in his survival kit. He'd kept the Zero hidden, covering it with palm fronds and broken branches, camouflaging it as best he could. He'd watched American planes pass overhead, transports, fighters, patrol bombers, each one a reminder of how thoroughly Japan had lost control of these skies. On the morning of the third day, he heard engines again, but these were different. Ship engines. Diesels. Coming closer. Tadashi ran to the beach and saw the destroyer, gray and lethal, cruising just offshore. They'd already seen him. 2 landing craft were being lowered, packed with Marines in helmets and flak jackets, rifles ready. There was no point in fighting. Tadashi walked to the waterline and raised his hands. The Marines hit the beach at combat speed, weapons up, shouting in English. Tadashi didn't understand the words, but the meaning was clear. He went to his knees, hands behind his head. A sergeant patted him down, removed his sidearm, a Type 94 Nambu pistol, and pulled him to his feet. They found the Zero 15 minutes later. Tadashi watched from the beach as the Marines stood around the aircraft, talking in low voices, taking photographs. One of them climbed into the cockpit and examined the instruments. Another ran his hand along the fuselage, counting bullet holes. A lieutenant approached Tadashi. He was young, maybe 23, with hard eyes and a translator's insignia on his uniform. "You speak English?" Tadashi shook his head. The lieutenant switched to broken Japanese. "Name?" "Rank?" "Lieutenant Tadashi Yamamoto. Imperial Japanese Navy Air Service." The lieutenant made notes. "Where from?" "Carrier Zuikaku." More notes. "This aircraft. You flew here from battle?" Tadashi hesitated. If he told the truth, if he explained what happened, it would be recorded. Documented. The Americans would know the Zuikaku was still operational, still had aircraft capable of reaching this far. Intelligence that might cost Japanese lives. But lying seemed pointless now. The war was over, even if no one had officially said so yet. "Yes. We were ambushed by your fighters. I was damaged and low on fuel. I landed here." The lieutenant studied him. "You flew a Zero alone, through our air defense zone, and landed on an island we use as a navigation point for supply runs to Iwo Jima." "I didn't know," Tadashi said quietly. "No," the lieutenant agreed. "I don't think you did." They took him to the destroyer. The Zero was left behind. They'd come back for it later, the lieutenant said. Intelligence would want to examine it, maybe ship it back to the States for evaluation. Captured Japanese aircraft were valuable, especially ones in relatively good condition. Tadashi was given water, food, a bunk below decks. The Marines guarded him but weren't cruel. One of them, a corporal with a Brooklyn accent, shared a cigarette with him, though they couldn't speak the same language. War did that sometimes. Made enemies into just 2 men sharing a smoke. The Gregory reached Guam on March 23, 1945. Tadashi was transferred to a POW camp, rows of tents behind barbed wire, filled with Japanese soldiers and sailors who had the misfortune of surviving battles meant to kill them all. He told his story to intelligence officers who wrote everything down in carbon-copied reports. He answered questions about the Zuikaku, about Zero tactics, about fuel consumption and ammunition loads. And then something strange happened. Or rather, nothing happened. His story disappeared. Months later, after the atomic bombs fell and Japan surrendered, after Tadashi was repatriated in the mass exchange of prisoners, he tried to find records of his capture. He wrote letters to American authorities, asking about the Zero he'd flown. What happened to it? Where was it sent? Was it in a museum somewhere? The responses were polite but vague. No record of a Zero captured on a small island west of Iwo Jima. No record of Lieutenant Tadashi Yamamoto being picked up by USS Gregory. The ship's log for March 20, 1945, showed routine patrol, nothing unusual. It was as if the landing had never happened. Tadashi eventually learned why, piecing it together from fragments and rumors. The island he'd landed on wasn't just a navigation waypoint. It had been a forward observation post, a place where American intelligence officers monitored Japanese radio traffic, tracked ship movements, and coordinated reconnaissance flights. The island was classified. Its location was classified. Everything about it was need to know. And a Japanese Zero landing there, photographed by Marines, examined by intelligence officers, created a problem. If the Japanese knew about the island, if word got out, even in a POW camp, it might compromise ongoing operations. So the decision had been made at some level above the lieutenant who'd interrogated Tadashi. Classify everything. Bury the reports. Remove the entry from the ship's log. Make it disappear. The Zero itself had probably been scrapped or dumped at sea. Too much trouble to explain. Too many questions. In the decades after the war, Tadashi rarely spoke about that day. He returned to a Japan rebuilt from ashes, worked as a mechanic for a commercial airline, married, raised 2 children. The Zero became a memory, something that felt increasingly unreal as the years passed. But sometimes, late at night, he would dream of it. The sound of the Sakae engine, the feel of the stick in his hand, the moment the wheels touched down on that jungle clearing. And he would wake with the certainty that it had happened, that he had lived through something true and strange and forever erased from history. In 1987, at the age of 66, Tadashi received a letter from the United States. Inside was a photograph, black and white, curled at the edges. It showed a Zero with distinctive markings, sitting in a jungle clearing, Marines standing around it. On the back, written in pencil, March 20, 1945. Location redacted. No note accompanied the photograph. No explanation. Just evidence that someone, somewhere, remembered. Tadashi kept the photograph in a wooden box with his flight logs and his old Type 94 pistol, recovered from American archives and returned to him decades after surrender. He never showed it to anyone except his grandson, who listened wide-eyed to stories of dogfights and forced landings and the day his grandfather disappeared from history. "Why did they erase it, Aji-san?" the boy asked. Tadashi looked at the photograph for a long time. Because war isn't just about who wins or loses. It's about what we choose to remember. And sometimes, forgetting is easier than explaining. The island still exists, somewhere in the Pacific. The jungle has long since reclaimed the clearing. If you knew where to look, if you dug beneath decades of vegetation, you might find traces of aluminum, rusted metal, pieces of a Zero that was never there. But the records remain empty. The flight never happened. The landing was erased. And Lieutenant Tadashi Yamamoto became a ghost in his own story, a man who flew into history and vanished without a trace.